Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2022. That brings us to a work which has been designated by Criterion at spy number 1112. This is a film from 1990, and the writers are Joel Coen and Ethan Coen, and this is produced by Ethan Coen and directed by Joel Coen. And the name of the work is Miller's Crossing. Extraordinary work from 1990, and it has an incredible cast, included in which are, for example, Gabriel Byrne and Marcia Gay Harden and John Polito and John Turturro, J.E. Freeman, Albert Finney, and others. And it is from the great filmmakers, the Coen brothers, Joel Coen and Ethan Coen. And the credits are written by Joel Coen and Ethan Coen, produced by Ethan Coen, directed by Joel Coen. And this is a Coen brothers work through and through. This is their 1990 film, Miller's Crossing. So much to say, I think, about the film Miller's Crossing, is there not, my friends? And one of the places we can go is focusing in on the general structure of the story or plot. Which involves, or which has been described oftentimes to be taking place in and around, say, Prohibition era, a major U.S. city of sorts, roaring 20s, this type of setting, so early 20th century. And furthermore, the setting is also described as taking place between and amongst certain gangland tensions, so gang warfare. This is a gangster film, a mobster film. And to be even more specific, it is focusing in on the characters played by, for example, Gabriel Byrne and Albert Finney. Albert Finney being the mob boss, Leo, a very memorable character, as portrayed so memorably and with such a force of nature type of strength to him. At the same time, with this heaping doses of humanity, which is a brilliant combination as portrayed by Albert Finney, his characterization of Leo, the boss, as it were. And another very crucial character in this film, that being his loyal, say, quote-unquote, right-hand man, the Gabriel Byrne character, who is Tom. And so this involves their characters. And already at the outset, we understand that there is much intrigue, much, say, potential betrayal upon betrayal, smoke screens. Things might not necessarily be what they appear. And already we get a scent of this, or a sense of this, when the film opens and we see the direct potential dilemma, namely another type of emerging powerful figure in this environment. This is Johnny Casper, the John Polito character, and he is coming to Leo with a problem dealing with another character who is referred to as Bernie. And so herein lies a type of dilemma. Will Leo betray Bernie for the sake of furthering relations with this this figure that is becoming stronger and stronger, that is Johnny Casper, for the sake of some kind of gangland diplomacy? Or will Leo's heart give in, because we understand too that he might have certain loyalties and connections to this mysterious character of Bernie because of Leo's heart and his emotions and the people and the particular woman that he is fond of. And this is the Marcia Gay Harden character, Verna. And so this is setting up already a type of complex web, a very, very complex web of, say, sinister double cross, of mysteries locked or unlocked, as the case may be, hidden agendas, of a type of maneuvering, this very type of autumnal and sardonic landscape as portrayed by the Coen brothers and company, of the underbelly of this gang world, of these gangs and the rivalry and the warfare, because there are indeed bursts of violence and also sudden shocks, if you will, of very intense drama, right? After all, if the idea of drama, or one of the conceptions of drama, is the interactions or the clashes between human beings, my goodness, do we get clashes in this film? These clashes can come in various shapes and sizes, from the type of dialogue banter that is oh so witty, oh so clever, from the wordsmiths who are Joel Coen and Ethan Coen, by way of, say, great authors for inspiration like Hammett, Dashiell Hammett, and we'll get to that later momentarily. So those sorts of dramatic human clashes can occur through the pages of dialogue that are delivered with such wit and care by the performers here. And or those clashes can come in types of comedic, almost absurd, maybe nonsensical or seemingly illogical scenarios or setups that can also be described as very Coen-esque. We have situations or scenarios of, say, the main character of Tom, Gabriel Byrne's character, and then suddenly being thrust into situations, situation upon situation upon situation, because there are many interested parties in the various, say, intrigues and machinations of the plot. This person, that person, that person, that person, and the other person. And Tom seemingly has to maneuver himself from this party to this party. And that is setting up the possibility for these absurdist, comedic, and maybe almost random feeling types of scenarios that also have doses of humor about them, which is also, again, another example of the dynamics of the human drama, clashes or collisions between characters. So that's another form. And yet another form of the human drama we see is the specific and highly plot mechanical types of mechanics. In other words, the plot almost demands that certain characters and the way that they've been set up need to clash in a certain way. And so the way in which the plot is finely tuned and intricate also serves to create these very satisfying character arcs that are established so well and so earnestly and so confidently early on, so as to be able to have them pay off either in a subtle way or perhaps in an explosive or climactic way as the plot progresses. And this is, again, another example of the machinations or the ever moving mechanics of the plot that lead to these wonderful character mapping and the ultimate, say, clashes of character that need to occur in order for the plot to evolve and to propel forward, excuse me. And it is done so genius level by everyone concerned. Speaking of which, too, the plot is so finely tuned. Everything is like an intricate puzzle piece. When you look at the piece itself, maybe it seems like it's its own random thing, and that is one of the great charms of the Coen brothers' works, is it not? And that is also part of their, say, comedic charm, and the way that they can take these examples and moments in time and link them to, say, art and history and a sense of American myth, as it were. In this case, Miller's Crossing, the idea of the painterly landscape, the cool breeze, the autumnal browns of the color palette, the type of, it's also described as being maybe almost Hopper-esque types of depictions of landscape and human beings enveloped in, say, light and shadow, while at the same time giving us a sense of the American myth, history early 20th century, linked to literary traditions of say Dashiell Hammett and others, and hard-boiled crime fiction, detective fiction, as well as the idea of the American myth leading to say the clashes of these characters in the context of early 20th century, roaring 20s, Prohibition era, etc. So this is, again, the puzzle pieces are examples of these moments in time, but we also understand, too, as with any other great Coen brothers work, each puzzle piece is connected to the other. And so when everything is connected and we see the grand scheme, the grand design, it is a sight to behold indeed. So this is another example of that, Miller's Crossing. So again, within the plot itself and the plot mechanics, characters collide, interact, and clash. And my goodness, they clash, do they not? And that leads to yet another example of where this film excels in terms of the portrayal of drama. The sudden bursts of these clashes, they can occur with a sense of panache, a sense of style, and a sense of real earnest and honest surprise. And then suddenly the film can turn quite, on purpose too, in an artistic way, quite ugly, quite dark, quite sinister, and very shocking, and yes, indeed, quite violent as well. So the way that this film can turn in this way to, again, express these scenes of clashes between characters, because this is, again, a film that is filled to the brim with characters that are just about ready to clash with each other. You know what I mean? Just it's just one false move, and then everything will just dissolve into chaos, as a matter of speaking, which is part of the sort of the entertainment appeal of a film like Miller's Crossing, or indeed other films from the Coen brothers, in the sense that everyone seems to have his or her own agenda, his or her own motives for doing what it is that he or she does, while at the same time colliding with others. And oftentimes too, or sometimes those collisions can be quite almost horrific, and almost shockingly horrific indeed. So it is in that way too that the Coen brothers show their style and the malleability of their style. There is a sense of order and structure to the presentation of the visuals and the sounds and the cues, but then there's also ways in which this film turns on a dime into an almost seemingly different type of genre, helpings or borrowings. Thus, I think showing to the great delight, I think, of many viewers like myself, showing us the extensive range and scope and breadth of the Coen brothers' style. Even at this so-called maybe earlier stage of their career, this film being 1990, so relatively early in their career, all the same, it is showing these hallmarks and then some, with a sense of class and grace, and also skill and dexterity and surprise and fine-tuned entertainment, deluxe to the max. It is all here in this film, Miller's Crossing. So there's so much going on here. And I touched only briefly upon some of the other great elements here, which are, I think, expounded upon much more skillfully in the Criterion Collection supplements than I could ever hope to achieve. So I would encourage you to check out the supplements. We will talk about those supplements in the latter half of this video, of course, but just to touch upon them now, we can speak to, for instance, the great visual design and setup, and Barry Sonnenfeld and his important camera work contributions, and the color schemes here as well, and then also the sounds and the music. For example, Carter Burwell as well, and his contributions here, giving a sense of the morose and the unease of the calm, type of calm before the storm type of setting, while also giving a sense of clever, witty irony to the proceedings, and also a sense of sincere earnestness as well, in trying to give us this portrayal of the world and the types of cultures that are also involved. And to the set design, the decor, the decoration, and we'll talk about that when we get to one of the supplements and the like. And as well, the links to literature I mentioned very briefly, in particular, the or mentioned very briefly, excuse me, the links that this film can be said to have with hard-boiled detective fiction, crime fiction. In particular, examples like Red Harvest, Glass Key, Dashiell Hammett, and so these points of reference and inspiration are brought up as well in a really lovely conversation. Again, we'll talk about it in one of the Criterion supplements discussion a little bit later in this video. But this, I think, is such an important point too, because it is also further identifying this work, Miller's Crossing, with the attempt or endeavor to try to capture a sense of what might be called the American myth, or the legend of the early 20th century American history. And that legend is being portrayed in cinematic form by way of reference to the past, obviously, right? But the references made to the past are also made via links to the wonderful tradition of this type of what's described as hard-boiled crime fiction, and Dashiell Hammett being, I think, the prime example when talking about Miller's Crossing. So this is, again, another great foundational point that solidifies Miller's Crossing in terms of its maybe cultural import. And last but certainly not least, we have to speak about the great performances. These performances are so wonderfully balanced, and they come together in this way where it seems like sometimes there might be one performance that might be due, some performances may be due to the characterization, really require a sense of the over-the-top nature, and then while other character performances or performances require, based on the characterizations, that there be a more sort of laconic or maybe non-dialogue approach to certain scenes. And then oftentimes there can be a sense of a very physical type of confrontational aspect to the characterizations, or sometimes these confrontations can be solely based on a look, a stillness, and also a delivery of line of dialogue, or again silence, as the case may be. And so I'm speaking of course of the great performances. Albert Finney as Leo, this type of boss character that is also having emotional character arcs as well, having to do with, for instance, the Marcia Gay Harden character Verna, and what a great performance that is too. There is a sense of there's a sense of a type of motivation behind her character that is, I think, revealed, but it's revealed in a way that's very organic and very much in keeping with the flow of the film. It doesn't feel like it's just expository, but rather it is very natural to the flow, and that flow is also due in part to the way which she interacts with various characters. I mentioned Leo. There's also the relationship between Tom, the Gabriel Byrne character, is also the John Turturro character as well. And so these, I think, are another examples of where we have seemingly different approaches and acting styles. There might be some characters that might go very much into the dialogue heavy territory, and then there's some characters like Tom too. I think Tom is a great example, the Gabriel Byrne character. There's some instances where he goes very much into the laconic, the quiet, the silence, the simple look from his eyes, or the simple gesture with his hat, which is another very important symbol which is referred to in the supplements, and we'll talk about that momentarily. Or his gestures or his physical movements alone will serve the scene, or depending on the scene, he will go very dialogue heavy and very much point by point, word by word, with the sharpness of the dialogue will shine through in a lot of those Tom scenes as well. So that is, I think, one of the great strengths of this film, Miller's Crossing, and the Coen brothers' filmmaking in general, which is that they're able to seemingly combine all sorts of things at once, and it never feels cramped. It never feels zany. Or I mean, well, zany. It feels zany, but it feels zany in a great way, because it's also controlled and not controlled. It is also chaotic, but also very much purposeful. And it also has a sense of the ludicrous and illogical, but it also makes sense at the same time. And that is a really that is a real genius accomplishment in terms of what the Coen brothers, I think, were able to achieve here in Miller's Crossing. And it is due, I think, for a lot of reasons. One of those reasons being the breadth of scope of characterization and characters and performance and acting styles. And sometimes those acting styles can even be within a single character, which is amazing. And it still fits the characterization and the mode and trajectory and the character arc of that particular character. And the main character of Tom is, I think, a great example of that. So in this way, I think Miller's Crossing delivers and then some. It is a fine example of this type of gangster film entertainment. It is a fine example of this cinema turned American myth or legend type of approach to filmmaking and storytelling. It is a fine example of 1990s cinema, late 80s, early 90s cinema of the time. And also, it is a fine example of the Coen brothers' output. And we know that the Coen brothers' output is incredible and it's vast. And one of those incredible points is this film from 1990. It is the work Miller's Crossing. The Criterion Collection has released this film, Miller's Crossing, at spine number 1112 with this Blu-ray edition, and this is purported to be based upon a 2K resolution, which is described in the booklet as Miller's Crossing is presented in its original aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1. This digital transfer was created in 2K resolution from the 35mm original camera negative, and also it's also described as a new 5.1 surround mix. And created in 2021, Warner Brothers Sound, New York. So we have here a 2K presentation of the work, again, for the purposes of this new Criterion release. I should point out, too, just a number of things before we get to the supplements. The running time of this particular Criterion release is listed at the back, right here on the back, right here. It's in small print, so I apologize if it can't be made out in terms of this video, but it says 113 minutes. And in fact, when I checked the counter, the clock counter on my Blu-ray machine, when I put this disc in, it had a total running time of 1 hour, 53 minutes, 12 seconds. So let's keep that in mind. And the reason why I bring this up is because which has also been commented upon, I understand, elsewhere in some really well-written reviews and write-ups that are reviewing and focusing in on this Criterion release of Miller's Crossing. Please note that older releases of this particular film, for example, this non-Criterion release, which I have, 20th Century Fox, which is from, according to the back here, 2011. This is a Blu-ray that I got here in Japan, in fact. This particular Blu-ray has the film, and it's the running time is, for this non-Criterion older release, 1 hour, 54 minutes, 51 seconds. So once again, the Criterion release is 1 hour, 53 minutes, 12 seconds. The older release is 1 hour, 54 minutes, 51 seconds. So there is a difference of about a minute and 30 seconds, 35, 40 seconds or so between the running times. Now, what accounts for this particular running time difference? I think, for one thing, I understand that the Criterion release's running time also includes the Criterion logo at the start. However, because the Criterion release has a shorter running time, that would mean that there would be perhaps a difference of nearly 2 minutes, I think. Or let's take the conservative estimate of, as I say, 1 minute and 30 seconds or 40 seconds or so. Now, where this running time discrepancy lies, I understand, is the Criterion release, this 2K restoration Criterion release, I understand, has undergone some slight trims, some slight edits or trims. And I also understand that, based on information that I was able to find, for instance, in these other really well-written reviews that can be found online, there have been instances where, indeed, for example, there's one scene in particular where it is noticeable that a small snippet of dialogue that was otherwise found in older releases has been cut out, has been trimmed out for purposes of this new Criterion release. And so my understanding is that the older version is a slightly longer version by about, as I say, a minute 30 seconds or so. And the difference is accounted for by the fact that the new Criterion release has undergone a number of, I understand, minor trims. Some noticeable, perhaps some not so noticeable, except for those who are expert in this particular film. And so, with that being said, if you are concerned about, say, having a quote unquote full or complete version of the film, then it might be worthwhile to check out some of the earlier non-Criterion releases if you're looking for, as I say, and I use air quotes, a full or complete version. However, I should also point out that from my vantage point, the trims here, I think, from a certain point of view, could be described as maybe not so significant in terms of having any kind of significant detrimental effect on my viewing of the film. In other words, I didn't feel in any way I felt like I was getting any less of a viewing experience. I didn't feel that way at all when I was watching this Criterion release. And I also point out that this is described as being approved by Barry Sonnenfeld and also by Joel Coen and Ethan Coen. So take that for what you will. If you are looking for this 2K restoration experience, and I'll get to the visuals momentarily, if you're looking for this Criterion experience, just know that there are some trims. But from my point of view, from my own personal viewing experience, it did not detract from my overall pleasure and enjoyment in watching this film again in the Criterion release. That being said, if you are looking for a somewhat more quote-unquote complete experience, you might as well try to find an earlier non-Criterion release, or if you have it already, just hold on to it just in case you're interested and you want to do a more comparative analysis and see which version works for you. And indeed, perhaps, who knows, maybe you might feel at the end of the day, in terms of that comparative analysis that you might conduct on your own terms, you might feel that ultimately the older version works for you, or perhaps the opposite, the newer Criterion version works for you. Whatever the case may be, just keep that in mind. Now, another aspect to the Criterion release is the fact that it is the new sound mix and also the visuals. Now, I must say that my ears are not so fine-tuned as many others who have already reviewed and assessed this particular Criterion release. So my comments in the sound department are very, very shallow indeed. That being said, I did find a lot of enjoyment with respect to the soundscape as I was enjoying the Criterion release. Also, in terms of the visuals, the same things apply in terms of my own very amateurish viewpoint as far as the visuals are concerned. And I have a very terrible lack of expertise when it comes to this department as well. That being said, from my own vantage point, I found that the color palette was well served in this particular restoration. I should note that originally my understanding of the film is that it is a very, maybe one could describe it as subdued, autumnal, in terms of its color scheme and the way that maybe shades and shadows are used. It's not necessarily a overly brightly colored film in a manner of speaking, although there are some of those sequences throughout the film. Indeed, when those sequences do come, there is a type of punch to the particular way in which color seems to emerge almost imperceptibly. And there's a particular moment as well at the beginning with the opening credit sequence that it has the woods as a backdrop, and there's a sudden turn of color intensity at a key moment in that opening sequence. I've noticed it in the older release, but take that as an example. It really stood out in a remarkable and memorable way when I watched this Criterion release. So in those, I think in that manner, it might seem like, as I say, maybe an initially autumnal-like viewing. But I think that's part of the point in terms of the palette, and indeed when there are those bright spots in terms of the intensity of color, I think they shine through in an effective way. So there is a calmness and stillness that I think is preserved, and that serves the mood and atmosphere of the film quite nicely. So those are just a few comments with regard to the presentation aspect. But now let us go to the supplements. As with many past Criterion releases, we have this particular release of Miller's Crossing that has a wealth of supplemental information and materials, and this is one of the great strengths of this particular release as well. And so, what are those supplemental materials that can be found here? First up is what's described as hard boiled. The Coen brothers and Megan Abbott, a conversation with Joel and Ethan Coen, and between them and Megan Abbott. This is described as being from 2021, approximately 28 minutes. This is a great discussion between and among these participants. So, for example, you know already that Megan Abbott is such a great fan and admirer of the Coen brothers' works and this particular film as well. You can tell immediately in the way that she's asking the questions, the type of questions that she's asking, and also the expertise that she brings to the conversation. It is such a well-rounded set of questions, and she is guiding the conversation, asking the questions, adding some supplemental information where appropriate, etc., but also respecting the time given to Joel Coen and Ethan Coen for purposes of their responses to her great questions, etc. It is a phenomenal, well put together conversation. So please check it out if you can. I mean, it's phenomenal for a number of reasons. For example, they do speak about the Coen brothers' experience growing up with film noir, watching film noir on TV, etc., and certain films that they bring up. And this is a very important point too, because there can be links that could be made between the film noir tradition, Hollywood film noir tradition, of, in particular, say, the 1940s and 1950s, and a film like Miller's Crossing, in the sense of the presentation of characters, a type of what might be described from a certain perspective anyway as maybe a nihilist approach to the philosophy and how the characters live their lives, and a type of darkness, especially perhaps regarding the darkness of the moral makeup of many of the main characters that we meet in Miller's Crossing, that might be said to have their film noir roots embedded quite significantly. And so this discussion is very appropriate indeed. And then maybe alongside that, there's also a great reference made to literature, the crime classics, Hard Boiled, Chandler, Kane are mentioned, also Hammett, Dashiell Hammett. Now, the Coen brothers, I think, and Megan Abbott make a really great point about how there might be other examples in the Coen brothers' filmography where, say, the works of Kane, James M. Cain are cited as direct references in those films, or maybe Raymond Chandler might be cited as a reference in others films. Well, for Miller's Crossing, I think the conceit, or the basis of reference point, I think is really safely acknowledged as being that of Dashiell Hammett. And here we have the Coen brothers and Megan Abbott making specific reference to certain Dashiell Hammett works, such as The Glass Key and Red Harvest. And this is, I think, one of the key points too. And they have a really great discussion about what, for example, distinguishes Dashiell Hammett's literature from, say, the works of other contemporary hard-boiled crime fiction writers, as an example, and how those distinctions in what makes Hammett's writings so profound and so memorable, how those certain characteristics also find their way in a tale like Miller's Crossing. So, for example, the way in which Dashiell Hammett tends to present or not present the inner workings of his main characters is very much, or could be said to be mirrored by the way in which the main character of Tom, the protagonist or anti-hero, depending on your point of view, of course, how the character of Tom seems to be presenting things that he's thinking, or that information about what he's thinking is withheld from us, the viewer. And so this type of showing or withholding the information of the inner thoughts of our main characters, I think could be said, or at least the three of them here are saying, have its purposeful roots in the way in which, for example, Dashiell Hammett presents some of his characters and some of his works. Also, the Dashiell Hammett treatment of reality and dream sequences. The concept of dreams and reality is also one that, or the concept is one that is very present, very much so in an overt manner as well, in various key points of Miller's Crossing. And also, too, to take Dashiell Hammett as a specific reference point, or to take the hard-boiled crime fiction uh, genre as an example, or even film noir for that matter. They do talk about the writing, the slang, the lingo that's used, because one of the memorable points, about this film is the use of language and the memorable lines of dialogue, and they do make reference to the point about how this is maybe there was an intent to trying to capture those literary or early cinematic traditions in the form of the dialogue as it was written by the Coen brothers. And then also the idea too of plotting, trying to figure out the notion of plotting, and to the way in which they perceive, and with Megan Abbott's also great explanations about this point, about how it seems like Dashiell Hammett's literature would tend to focus a lot on objects, specific objects, and how in Miller's Crossing too, one can say that the filmmakers are focusing in on specific objects, not necessarily in a fetishistic type of way, but in a very intensely cinematic way to increase, say, certain dramatic or tense points. There's a very memorable sequence involving the character of Leo in his particular house, somewhat maybe in the early half of the film. And in that scene, for those of you who've seen the film, you'll recall that the scene or the camera does focus in on certain objects as well, which I think is very much apropos in the tradition of Hammett, at least as they've discussed it here. Two, they talk about the use of voiceover in other films, or the non-use of it in a film like, say, here or others, or instances of non-use, and how that was a purposeful tactic on the part of the Coen brothers, again in the context of the Hammett discussion, and also the idea too of thematic treatments. There's a tendency too of showing what might be described as institutional rot, the moral decay on a societal level, perhaps, or it could be posited as being speaking to a societal level vantage point. And I think a lot can be said too about Miller's Crossing too, and there might be said to be a sort of societal rot that has baked in, as it were, into the inner workings of the plot. Two, going back to language, to the idea not just of lingo and the slang, but also the invention of certain words of the English language. This was such a great aspect, great fun part of reading Hammett. And the like, and so too, the idea of the world and the darkness, and the world being a place of chaos, and the landscapes too. And this leads into a great discussion about how the Coen brothers were really trying to focus on the landscapes, the city, and also the woods and the trees. And the like, and that leads to a great discussion about the settings and the locale, the New Orleans location shooting, and how this could stand in for a type of traditional, classic-looking city that could have been anywhere in the United States, which is, I think, the perfect setup for purposes of what the Coen brothers appear to be doing. And also the concept, going back to where we started, which is film noir, or the oft-used phrase, perhaps neo-noir, whatever that means, of course, in the context of a particular discussion. Be that as it may, this also leads to a great, I think, great point as to how this work, Miller's Crossing, can nicely fit into the overall context of the filmography of the Coen brothers. And so references are made to other films like Barton Fink, Big Lebowski, etc. And I think that can be extended to other films as well, The Man Who Wasn't There, Fargo, perhaps. And then there's a lovely anecdote about the actors, working with the actors, and, for example, Albert Finney. There are some great anecdotes throughout the supplements regarding Albert Finney, and here's one of them. So overall, this is a wonderful, wonderful discussion between and among the Coen brothers and Megan Abbott. Once again, approximately 28 minutes. But that's not all, because then we get more supplements. The next of which being it's called The Actors, and this is a supplement with Gabriel Byrne and John Turturro, again described as being from 2021, approximately 32 minutes. And once again, we have the great Megan Abbott moderating, also joining into the discussion, asking wonderful, great, pointed, specific questions. And once again, you can tell she loves this film, and she knows this film in and out. It's great. She's a wonderful interviewer, and she is again guiding us. She is our guide to this wonderful conversation with these fine actors, and they each are talking about, say, their first impressions, getting to know the Coen brothers, how they ended up being in the film, what were their connections with the Coen brothers, and so they each give their quite, I think, unique and different stories and perspectives. And then also in the context, for instance, Gabriel Byrne talks about meeting Marsha Gay Harden and trying to have a type of dynamic between their characters, even at a type of rehearsal or even audition stage. So, and then they talk about their approach to the script, and it's described at one point in the conversation as being a dense, thick script, and that kind of makes sense in terms of the way in which dialogue is also a very important part of this particular film. Also, the notion too of the portrayal of the gangster element, these characters, they are portrayed with a moral code at the very outset with for example, Casper. He has a moral code, which is expressed throughout wonderful moments of either the moments of his own dialogue scenes, as well as the other characters going forward. So that kind of interesting way of humanizing the gangster character element of this film, I think, goes a long way too in also helping to support the wonderful solidifying aspects of their approaches to the characters, the actors. So this is another great thing. Also, speaking about the slang or lingo or dialogue or language, the actors here speak about the wonderful cadence, rhythms that were part of the speech, and you can tell in many of the scenes, rhythm is very important. The speed and rhythm and the intonation and the sounds. This is also very much important element of Miller's Crossing, and indeed, too, it could be said of other Coen brothers' work. So I'm very glad that this was alluded to, especially in a film like Miller's Crossing, which could be said to have a film noir, pulp fiction type of rhythm or cadence to the dialogue delivery. And two, there is the idea of how they describe the working with the Coen brothers as being everything was more or less highly pre-planned. With little, if any, room for improvisation. However, there were concepts or character traits that were embedded in that, as I say, focused in on objects or the use of objects, which reminds us too of how the Coen brothers and Megan Abbott talked about objects in the context of Dashiell Hammett. So here, the example that's given is something about peeling an orange. So, and the idea too of the world of chaos, and also the intricacy of the plot, and the notion too of, say, a character like Tom, how everything is very internalized, and so how to express that which is intensely internalized, and how to make that an effective portrayal of a character that we as viewers need to follow and have us guide us as we watch the film. So this is, I think, a really tricky aspect of film acting and performance. I can only speculate this. I'm not a professional actor, so I don't know, but I can reasonably guess or assume that this is a very tricky thing, and so I think the performers here do an exquisite job of doing this. Namely, we have the main character of Tom, who seems to be speaking in a lot of these wonderful bursts of dialogue in some instances, but at the same time, in other places, very silent, very internalized. So we follow him, and we need to follow him as our guide throughout the plot, but at the same time, there are many things that are unknown to us as viewers. And I think this type of tension between the knowns and the unknowns with regard to our viewpoint, we viewers, our viewpoint of the main character and other characters indeed, I think is a really a skillful aspect of this particular work, and it's due in large part to, of course, the filmmakers and, of course, the actors as well. And the idea too of thinking. These characters are thinking, and they are shown thinking and pondering and wondering and guessing. And so this is I think a really it's a joy to watch, indeed. It's a joy also to listen to the actors here, Gabriel Byrne and John Turturro, speak about this, and They talk about too dreams, dream sequence, or not dream sequences, but the concept of dreams, how it's handled in the film. Also, the symbolism of hats, or the hat in particular. And also, they talk too about the release of the film. Now, this is a film from 1990, and so maybe they felt like it might have not had necessarily an overly successful release, maybe compared to other films that might have been released at the time. They mentioned, for instance, Goodfellas too. However, at the same time, they do also mention how Miller's Crossing has enjoyed and does still enjoy a wonderful longevity in terms of popularity and appeal. And it has a lovely crossover appeal as well, and a great afterlife. And so I think that is proved in many aspects. For example, it's proved by this current Criterion release. So all in all, another great conversation here, Gabriel Byrne and John Turturro and Megan Abbott. So please check it out if you can. And that's not all, because continuing on, we have the supplement, which is the music, talking about the music with Carter Burwell and Todd Kassow, who is the music editor, and Burwell, excuse me, is the he wrote the music, or composed the music here. Very memorable score. And so this is a discussion with them, approximately 16 minutes from 2021. And Carter Burwell talks about his working with the Coen brothers leading up to Miller's Crossing, how there is somewhat a there's an intimate way in which the scores prior to Miller's Crossing were composed, but then with Blood Simple and Raising Arizona, for example. But then with Miller's Crossing, he describes it as being a different point regarding the use of an orchestra, or a larger orchestra, at least compared to before. And then also the concept of the music editor being introduced in terms of Carter Burwell's work in the context of film scores, and then Todd Kassow coming in here as well. So this is, I think, a very revealing aspect to a very popular and incredibly strong part of this film, and indeed other Coen brothers works, which is the Carter Burwell contribution. So it's also described here regarding the coldness and brutality of the film, and then that's how reflected in the score itself. The concept too of reliance or use as reference points or inspiration, Irish music, and it's described as kind of sketches, and we have the also big band type of cues, and there's also the idea of sentimental scores, and there's a sense of the sentiment and the sentimental used in a very effective way, and also the capturing or evoking the time period, and also the concept of traditional music. There's a very key sequence, many key sequences where music is employed so skillfully and so effectively. And so here we have a conversation about Danny Boy, and or Londonderry Air, and how there was a very important a scene involving this particular song or sequence that needed to be treated in terms of a recording or special recording. And so those details are revealed by this particular discussion. These and other reasons, I think, are reason enough, strong reason enough to check out this particular conversation. So please check it out if you can. Continuing on with the supplements, we have an audio discussion with kind of a montage of clips or shots or photos, and this is called The Look with Barry Sonnenfeld, who is the director of photography. And this is again described as being from 2021, approximately 15 minutes. This is great because Barry Sonnenfeld in this discussion speaks about his background, his education, also his studying of film, etc. at New York University, for example, how he had his start working on, say, industrial work films and also pornographic movies, and then leading to his involvement with the Coen brothers' world at this time. And so Blood Simple, Raising Arizona, and then Miller's Crossing here. And he describes Miller's Crossing as his favorite as a director of photography, and how it relates to his work as a cameraman. And he talks too about the film being, quote, a handsome film, the use of long wide-angle lenses, and he speaks too about specificities of film stock in order to capture the nighttime exteriors, or the idea of lighting to capture specific aspects of the flesh tone of the characters, all the way down to these particular details. So this is a very valuable aspect indeed. And he speaks too, when he's talking about film stock, he does talk about how he wanted to use a different type of film stock, Fuji, for purposes of the outdoor wood scenes, in order to handle the way in which that particular film stock would capture certain colors, in particular the color green, green sensitivity issues and the like. So this is a very interesting aspect too, about how the philosophy of the visual seems to be to try to capture this, what he describes as maybe muted or pastel look to certain the visual flair and style of film, such as the very iconic wood sequences that form, I think, the title's namesake, as well as other very important plot elements to the film. And he does speak too, there's an interesting detail that he talks about, how they needed to shoot outdoors, and there's a particular shot where he says it was shot especially afterwards, because for time and for a close-up, or a pickup or whatever. But they tried to take advantage of the sort of muted aspect of the weather, except for one particular shot. He cites it in this audio interview. However, I should point out an interesting detail, which is in the earlier Miller's Crossing release, which is what I have here, there is a very similar interview with Barry Sonnenfeld, where he speaks about many of the same points that are spoken about in this audio interview. And this idea of what was shot and what was added later, or what was shot later as a type of close-up or pickup shot, that also came up. The shot that he describes, actually, here in the Criterion interview, is different, I think, from the shot as he described it in the interview that we see in an earlier release. So that's an interesting detail. So again, it adds, I think, to the almost myth of the making of the film, as it were. But it's also a great detail, and maybe it's a mixture of both. Who knows? But in any event, we have Barry Sonnenfeld's details on outdoor shooting and location shooting, and also he talks about the importance of pre-design. There's a lot of pre-design, he says. He does also talk about how he communicates with the Coen brothers, or how they communicate. There's a type of shorthand communication, as he describes it. And he also describes how Joel Coen might focus more on shorter, tighter shots, whereas Ethan Coen might focus more on wider shots. So Barry Sonnenfeld would try to calculate, if you wanted to make a request as to how short or how tight or how wide he wanted to go, that would then have him ask one of brother or the other, depending on what kind of shot he was looking for. That was an interesting detail. And then he speaks too about what was mentioned earlier in other supplements about New Orleans location shooting. And also the importance of storyboards, and also the idea too of editing, how he shot with the notion of keeping editing in mind. An interesting concept he brings up here is shooting, or the camera movements, in order to preserve a type of fluidity that could be enhanced in editing. In other words, having movements of camera that could then be used later in the editing room to, say, edit shots together that are moving shots edited into other moving shots. And so the idea of the preservation of fluidity that is emphasized, or the filmmakers are conscious of, even at the shooting stage. So this is a very important aspect. He refers to the cutting order, and this was one aspect to maybe certain decisions of the camera movement phase. And the idea too of deciding, how he describes certain scenes, that deciding which of those scenes need to be quote unquote beautiful, and which scenes needed quote unquote more coverage, and a lot of lighting considerations he brings up, and how this therefore lends to his mind the fact that for him Miller's Crossing is, as he uses the word so well and so throughout the interview, a beautiful work. And also he talks about John Turturro, and how the idea of John Turturro, how Barry Sonnenfeld gives the anecdote about how John Turturro revealed to him that he based his performance on Barry Sonnenfeld. Although John Turturro does make mention of this particular anecdote or counters it in the earlier supplement where he's speaking with Megan Abbott and others. So that's an interesting little anecdote, or maybe debated anecdote, as it were, in a very playful way. And then last but not least, Barry Sonnenfeld does here about another great anecdote about the wrap-up party and his own personal life and Albert Finney. And another lovely story about Albert Finney and fireworks. So please check this out. It is a delightful conversation. Once again, if you have an earlier release, there are some similar points that are discussed, but there are also some really interesting, one could say, differences as well. So it further enhances or embellishes the overall feeling and idea and story behind the making of the film. So great introduction, or great inclusion to have here, the interview with Barry Sonnenfeld. That's not all in terms of supplements, because then we have a discussion, also audio, with Dennis Gassner, production designer, and this is called The Design, approximately 10 minutes, again from 2021. He talks about the production designer having a type of approach like an architect, and how he was inspired by films like Lawrence of Arabia, and then also the visual language, the cinema language of Coen brothers, working with the Coen brothers, unusual language, as he puts it, and the visual motif of columns, vertical columns, vertical lines, and how this is emphasized not only in the city landscapes, the buildings and the vertical lines that are associated with the building structure architecture inherently, but also the vertical lines of the woods. Miller's Crossing, I mean, you can see representation of it really nicely in this cover art design here. So this is a very interesting concept, and I think it has this sense too of a type of overpowering aspect of the environment or atmosphere. It also has a sense of maybe on purpose, in a poetic way, diminishing the human element, or maybe also giving a sense of order, visual order, even when the story bursts forth with splashes of chaos and anarchy. So that type of visual motif that clashes, I think, is very consistent with the way in which this film is a combination or collection of certain dramatic clashes that we were speaking of earlier. And to New Orleans is also mentioned again, how also working with the Coen brothers, it tends to be a very calm, quiet setting, as he describes it, which is also consistent with other comments made by others in other supplements and the like. So, and also working with the Coen brothers and the story, fun, intelligent, and also the importance of color palettes and research going into the design. The design aspect of Miller's Crossing is divine, so divine, and those details are really quite exquisite. So here's another great supplement, so please check it out if you can. And that's not all, because then we have a supplement which is described as From the Archives. And From the Archives is these are interviews that are described as being from 1990, all assembled, totaling approximately 13 minutes. And these are interviews with Gabriel Byrne, Marcia Gay Harden, John Turturro, and John Polito. And so it's edited. We have maybe a segment with one actor, and then another segment with another actor, and another segment with another actor, and then editing back to the previous actor to create this type of montage or collection of excerpts of these archival interviews. And so this is great. For instance, Gabriel Byrne talks about the deep themes, as he mentions, of this gangster film. This is a gangster film that has very profound themes and motifs, and it's hard not to agree with that concept, because it is a very, I think, a deep rooted work. He called off center. I think it's a good way of putting it. Also, John Polito talks about his role as Johnny Casper, and how maybe the role might have been written for someone who was a little bit older than he was. He describes himself as being 38, 39 years old at the time of making the film, and Johnny Casper maybe was, it was intended to be maybe a somewhat 50 years old or so character, but he played it and he got the role. And he plays it with such relish and such force and such abandon, and also such danger and charisma as well, and comedy as well. So it's a great performance, and I'm so glad we got John Polito comments here. And Marcia Gay Harden too how she talks about the intense artistry, the quiet, calm set of the Coen brothers, and the like. And John Turturro speaks about how there was a little bit, not a lot, a little bit of improvisation, but there was also, most of it was planned. And so this is consistent with what we heard before about it. It was more or less highly, highly pre-planned, with maybe some room here and there for improvisation, but not much. And so, but that's okay too, because even in the pre-planning, we get an exquisite output that is the end result of Miller's Crossing. And Marcia Gay Harden talks about other maybe past works. The Public Enemy film is mentioned. She mentions also Jean Harlow as maybe a reference point for her own character, Verna. And Gabriel Byrne then talks about Albert Finney, working with Albert Finney, and the character of Tom, what he says versus what he doesn't say, and also the significance of the hat, etc. I should point out that a similar type of supplement of archival interviews, in fact, I think it's the same source, it's found in a previous version, for instance, this Blu-ray that I have from Japan. So it's edited differently than what we saw before, so we're getting a little snippets that are different, or emphasis on different comments here. But I think that is not to take anything from the Criterion assembly of this particular source material. In fact, the assembly is really great for a number of reasons. For instance, the inclusion of John Polito's comments, for example, I think make this, as an example, make this particular offering from Criterion be really great. So please check it out if you can. It's really worthwhile. So this is, again, approximately 13 minutes. Yes, 13 minutes. Again, archival interviews dated from 1990. Now, with the discussion of the supplements that we've just finished, now let us go to the presentation itself and then the insert. Now, I've already taken the liberty of removing the insert from the inside here. And as you can see, the inside houses this particular disc. And I love the design of the hat as well for the disc. And then also the cover art design, I think, is really well done. I should point out that this cover art design, please give me one moment here. Yes, art designer Eric Skillman, Sarah Habib, or sorry, art directors, excuse me, Eric Skillman, Sarah Habibi, illustration Patrick Ledger. So I'm very impressed with this this design, very much so. It looks really wonderful. And again, the color motifs, I think, reflect so nicely what can be described as the autumnal nature of the overall look and aesthetic of the film Miller's Crossing. So well done for this, and I like the font use as well. And then we have the insert here. It's a fold-out type. I'm not a fan of the fold-out type, but I must say that I do like the paper that's used. This doesn't feel like the paper or the material that's been used in past fold-outs, but it feels a little bit thicker and a little bit more substantial, for lack of a better phrase. So I do like the use of the paper here, and I have noticed that this similar feeling type of paper has been used in recent Criterion releases, other releases. So I hope this continues. Again, I would have liked to have seen a staple booklet, but that's still okay. And one of the reasons why it's okay is because we have a great essay, which is called Marvelous Americans, Glenn Kenny's essay. It is phenomenal. Once again, I would recommend not reading the essay until you have seen the film, because it does go into specific details of the plot and the background of the Coen brothers and the sort of historical significance, the artistic significance, the literary significance, and the cinematic past significance, and how it becomes a combination of these, and then also at the same time a truly wonderful, delightful, and unforgettable work by these great filmmakers of our generation, the Coen brothers, Joel Coen and Ethan Coen. So a great essay to check out after you've seen the film. Once again, it is called Marvelous Americans. And so, my dear friends, this is a very basic discussion about this recent release by the Criterion Collection of Miller's Crossing, purported to be based on the 2K restoration. Once again, you might have heard, again, about how this might be a slightly shorter running time version of the film, but I try to emphasize slightly because I can say that from my vantage point, it did not at all take away from my enjoyment of the work. It was, and I think one can make the argument too that maybe these quote-unquote trims are things that, again, ultimately do not detract at all. And when I watched that, I don't think I noticed it as much or at all, except for maybe one line of dialogue that wasn't there before, or that was there before but not here now. Excuse me. So, but I think I know for some people this is a very important concept of having a quote unquote complete version, and so if you feel that way, then maybe it might be worthwhile getting an earlier copy of Miller's Crossing if you can. And again, too, I'm not sure. I don't have the strong expertise when it comes to all the possible versions of this particular work. So I have a lot of learning to do and a lot of studying to do when it comes to that as well. But I can say right now, where I am right now, I enjoyed the Criterion release thoroughly, absolutely thoroughly, and I think it's due in large part to, well, not just the supplements, but also primarily because of the film itself. And as I say, I was not at all distracted, or my enjoyment was not at all diminished. But on the contrary, I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I think I will continue to enjoy this work again, as presented by Criterion earlier this year. This is the work by Joel Coen and Ethan Coen from 1990, Miller's Crossing. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.